This lecture is part two of in this two-part series. The first part was on the New England colonies. This is going to be on the Mid-Atlantic colonies. So the Mid-Atlantic colonies are going to be colonies that don't quite fit in. They're different than the New England colonies and the Southern colonies in that they're not necessarily English. The New England colonies were founded by England and the Southern colonies were founded by England. But here, stuck in the middle, we have these very heterogeneous, diverse, ethnically, religiously speaking colonies right in the middle of the Atlantic seaboard. So the first one we're going to talk about is New Amsterdam. It started out as a Dutch colony. Today it's called New York, but we can see on the map on the bottom right hand side, it's this area that's shaded in red that goes up and down the Hudson River. Now, the colony was founded by the Dutch, but it was a company colony. It was controlled by the Dutch West India Company, and its whole purpose was to make money for the corporation. And they did this primarily by looking for furs. So, much like the French model, the Dutch would trade with Native Americans for furs, and then they would ship them back to Europe to sell there. In return, the Native Americans would get guns and iron and steel tools, beads, alcohol, those kinds of things that the Native Americans wanted that they didn't have access to before. As a result, Dutch treatment of Native Americans was very similar to the French treatment of Native Americans. The Dutch didn't try to convert the natives all that much. They wanted to have friendly relations with some of the natives so that they could trade furs with them. After all, the Native Americans went and found the furs for them. And so we don't see that the Dutch are trying to control the Native Americans like the Spanish did. We don't see them having just outright warfare with the Native Americans like the English model. We see them trying to work with many of the Native Americans in the region so they could get access to their furs. Inside New Netherland, New Amsterdam, we see that the colony itself is controlled by the company, but also these large shareholders in the company who own lots of land up and down the Hudson River Valley, and they're called patroons. Now these patroons, these wealthy, if you want to think of them as noble Dutch families, are going to continue to have a lot of influence over the colony of New Amsterdam and then eventually New York. Some people like the Roosevelts and those kinds of things will get their start in New Amsterdam and then continue on even though they're under English rule. So eventually the King of England decides that he doesn't want New Amsterdam to exist anymore. He looks at a map of his colonies and we see that we have English colonies in pink here, New England. We have English colonies in the south, the southern colonies, and having New York underneath this blue circle here, right in the middle, is kind of a thorn in the English colonies' side. They're afraid that, if we let the Dutch stay along the Atlantic seaboard, that eventually they might threaten England's other colonies in this part of the world. And so the king will send his younger brother, the Duke of York, with a fleet, and they will go into New York Harbor and tell the Dutch that you must surrender or we're going to take you. So here we see in this picture here, the Dutch are trying to decide whether they should fight or not, and eventually they decide not to fight. There's just too many English ships in the harbor. The Dutch realize it's just easier to surrender. The English will let them keep their property. And really, for most of the Dutch people and other ethnicities that are in New Amsterdam, not a lot changes too much. It's still primarily a Dutch-speaking colony. And they'll still keep their property, but now they just have new overlords. Instead of the Dutch West India Company, now it's just the British government. Let's now move on a little bit further down the coast. We'll go to Pennsylvania, the next major big colony in the middle colonies. Now, unlike New York, this starts out as an English colony. It starts out with a man by the name of William Penn. William Penn comes from an extremely rich family in England. He is a member of the aristocracy. And William Penn, he is a little bit different than most of the aristocracy in England because he has joined a new religious group called the Society of Friends, commonly known as the Quakers. Now, the Society of Friends, they are Christian. They're a Protestant group, which means they're Christian but not Catholic. But he doesn't belong to the Church of England. And so he and his fellow followers of the Society of Friends, or Quakers, they're persecuted in England because they don't belong to the King of England's church, which means that they are dissenters in a way, that they are rebelling against the king religiously, and so he doesn't like them. But there are other things that make them different that the king and the people of England don't like. One is they won't take oaths. They believe that it says in the Bible that you should not swear an oath, and so that means that they won't swear any oath to anyone. And so when the king says, "Are you loyal English citizens?" they say yes. He says, "Well, then swear loyalty to me." And they say, "Look, the Bible says we can't do that." And so the king suspects their loyalty. Next, they're pacifists. In the Bible, it says that, if one hits you on a cheek, you should turn the other cheek and offer them the other. And so they said this is God and Jesus commanding us not to be violent, even if we're attacked. And so the king doesn't like this because he wants people in his military and his navy. And if they're pacifists, they won't join. And so that's another example of them not being loyal to him. We already talked about them not being Anglican. And then also, their religious ceremonies are different. If we remember from previous lectures, the Church of England is very hierarchical, right? You've got the King of England, and then you have archbishops and bishops all the way down, just like the Catholic Church. But the Quakers believed that they're all equal in the eyes of God, and that they don't need any ministers, they don't need any preachers. And so what we see is this picture here on the right-hand side of a Quaker service. We see people sitting down. Notice there is no front to this church. There is no altar. There is no place where all eyes are attached. It's just people sitting down, men on one side, women on the other, and they just sit and they wait. And then if somebody from the community has something to say, maybe they feel divinely inspired, they stand up and they talk to everybody about their feelings and their relationship with God, and then they sit back down and they quietly contemplate it. And so we see that this is certainly, anybody can participate, even women can take leadership roles in the Quaker Church, which makes them different than other people. And you know how humanity is, if somebody's different, we fear them. And so we see that they are persecuted for that reason. Pennsylvania is also a very liberal colony. Since the Quakers are going to be the ones that go there to escape religious persecution, so in a sense it's like Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, people come for religious freedom. Since they're persecuted in England, they come to Pennsylvania. William Penn owns most of the colony, and so they settle there. And so they want to establish a very liberal colony. And what I mean by liberal, I mean it's just, like the definition means, it's just change. It's different from the past. And so in this colony, there'll be no official tax-supported church. They don't believe that the government should be supporting one faith over another. That leads to tyranny. People should be free to live and let live. It's a very Quaker way of thinking. Look, I will follow the Bible the way I want, and you can follow it the way you want, and we won't have any hierarchy. Everybody's free to do what they want to do and have their own relationship with God. And so no official tax-supported church. Which means that there'll be lots of people come to Pennsylvania, not just Quakers, but if you're Catholic or Jewish or you're Anabaptist or any type of religious group, that you know that you can go to Pennsylvania and you won't have to pay extra taxes for a church you don't belong to, and your religion is not going to get persecuted. Next, the Quakers also believe in fair treatment of Native Americans. And so when William Penn comes when he opens up the colony of Pennsylvania, he says, look, I don't want you guys stealing land from Native Americans. And so the colony has a policy of buying land from Native Americans. And so we see a much better relationship, as you see in this picture, between the Quakers and the Native Americans. There's not this friction over land because they just don't come and take it. Now, as time goes on and we get into the 1700s, the later 1700s, we'll see all of these other people coming to Pennsylvania who are not Quakers. They will have friction with Native Americans because they don't have this religious problem with taking lands from Native Americans. So later on, of course, there will be some conflict. Next, it says religious freedom for everybody, like I had mentioned. Catholic and Jews, we do see a large Jewish population in Pennsylvania, as well as we talked about before, Rhode Island. However, Catholics and Jews, they can practice their faith freely, but they cannot vote or hold office. The Quakers still want this to be a primarily Quaker-controlled colony. Next, we see that they're going to have a representative assembly, just like in England. So this is an example of Anglicization of the American colonies. That just means that they are copying ideas from England. If England has a parliament with representative democracy, well, that's what they're used to. And so when these English Quakers come to Pennsylvania, it's natural that they would reestablish systems that they're used to. And so the people of Pennsylvania vote for the leaders of Pennsylvania. And again, England, and up until we get close to the Revolution, will leave them alone because They're just not generating a lot of wealth. Next, suffrage for all property-owning white males. And so we see if you are a Christian who is a Protestant, and you don't even have to own any amount of land, you can just vote. And so we see, again, this is a liberal colony because they are taking this new step of letting everybody vote who wants to. All right, next, Pennsylvania. Let's finish up Pennsylvania, talk about the large migration. Pennsylvania, because of this liberal idea that we're going to let people have religious freedom and we're going to let people vote, well, most people vote, we're going to see that it's very attractive for people. So that's a pull factor into Pennsylvania. In addition to that, William Penn realizes that the only way he can really be a success as a colony is if he has people come to his colony and buy land from him. And it's because, in theory, he owns all the land of Pennsylvania. And so he goes around Europe, mostly Western Europe, and he advertises, hey, there's amazing land in Pennsylvania, good farmland. We have religious freedom. We don't have any established churches. Our taxes are really low. You can elect your own representatives. And so all of these things pull people to Pennsylvania, and the population grows fairly rapidly. And if we look at this map, we see that we have in Pennsylvania, you notice that a large section of Pennsylvania is going to be this kind of brown color. And so lots of Germans are going to migrate to Pennsylvania. There's so many Germans come to Pennsylvania that we call them the Pennsylvania Dutch. It's kind of a misnomer, but when the German immigrants started to flood into Pennsylvania, the English colonists who were there, the Quakers, they said, where are you from? And they said, I'm from Deutschland. And they just mistook it for being from the Netherlands, from Dutch, when Deutschland, of course, means German. And so we see all of these German come in, and we have Germantown, Pennsylvania. We have all these little establishments, and really, in a large section of Pennsylvania, people have kind of recreated a new Germany. People speak German, there's German newspapers, German culture is prevalent, and so we see that we not only have English people living in Pennsylvania, but now we have a large German population as well. And then the next group that I want to talk about that comes to Pennsylvania are the Scotch-Irish. We can see them in green color. And the Scotch-Irish, they were Scottish originally, and then they had trouble with the English. The English and the Scottish are always fighting over who gets to control Scotland. And so they move out to Ireland. Once they go to Ireland, the English will follow them, and they'll attack the Scottish again, and so the Scots, now Irish, will eventually move to America. And when they get to America, they think, well, maybe this is far enough away from England that the English won't attack us anymore. And so they move as far inland as they possibly can, up into the hills of the Appalachian Mountains. And so we see them really far west into Pennsylvania at this point. And so we have this very large group of people, the Scotch-Irish, who hate the English and want to get as far away from them as possible. And so they move up into the mountains of Pennsylvania, and then we'll see they just kind of slide down the mountains. They'll go further and further south, and the Scotch-Irish will be eventually in most of the colonies in Pennsylvania and south of Pennsylvania, up living on the mountaintops. We'll talk about them when we get to the American Revolution, but they are certainly going to not have any love for the British when the American Revolution comes around because of their past history. Next, people are attracted to Pennsylvania because the land is cheap. All you have to do, seemingly, is go to Pennsylvania, chop down some trees, and you've got a farmland. If you remember, in Europe, most of land is taken up by the nobility, but here there's an abundance of land. Native Americans are dying off because of diseases, and so the land is there for the taking. And so they're attracted by the cheap land, fertile climate and soil. In fact, Pennsylvania is on the same line of latitude as much of Europe, and so if you're a farmer in Germany, and you want to come someplace new in the world, you want to go someplace that reminds you of Germany because you know how to grow crops there, you know when to plant, you know what crops will grow. And so because it's this green, rolling, lush climate that's very similar to Germany, it's certainly going to attract lots of Germans to the region. And that's it for our second part of the slideshow.